Welcome to the E&C Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by E&C Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking EU energy policy and how it's affecting the power, gas and carbon markets in particular, but also perhaps signifies a pendulum swinging back to a more regulation and government intervention in energy markets in the wake of the European energy crisis. To talk about what policy changes have been enacted or possibly can be enacted is Bart Verest. Bart is the lead partner at E&C Consultants, an international consultancy focused on energy procurement and markets with their headquarters in Belgium. Bart is an expert in energy markets and energy contracts. As always, if you like the show, please do follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube. And also, please, if you get the chance, leave us a positive review or 5 stars on the platform you're listening on. It really does support the show. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Bart, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about EU energy policy, and in some senses how we're swinging from a period of liberalization and deregulation, and this is a trend happening globally that we're tracking into a more of a regulated environment, and what that means for the European energy sector, for traders, procurers, the whole group.
Mm-hmm.
And we're picking out a few key discussions and potential changes that are going on right now. Before we dig into those examples and the effects they might have, can you just give us some sense of how it works? Who is actually designing EU energy policy? The 101 on that.
So on the EU level, we obviously have all of the member states playing their role, but there is a very strong role for that coming from the European Commission. And that's what we see as well. When we talk about energy markets and later on talking about the design of the markets, we will see that there are some regulations set by the Commission and the Council, and that there are directives, and those are obviously leading the direction that the countries has to follow. So there is a strong centralization on the European level, and that gives the direction that member states have to follow.
Yeah, and how exactly does the process work? I mean, is there a long period of consultation? How do these things get signed off? Just so we can track these policies and indeed some sense of timelines.
So we typically have quite a lengthy process of regulation. It initially kicks off, and what we do for some of the customers is what we make a legislative train. So we basically track each of the train stations where the regulation stops. What is interesting, what is relevant for traders, for people in procurement world, is that one of those stations is the phase of consultation. So that's typically the moment where you have the opportunity and the chance to have your say when something is put out for a consultation. Unfortunately, those periods of consultations are sometimes relatively short, or they end up in summer periods or holiday periods. But that's really the key moment where you can influence everything and have your say, next to the obvious lobbying throughout earlier stages of the legislative process.
Just setting the scene here as well. I mean, how significant has energy policy, market design, which is what we're going to be leaning into, been in terms of legislative goals and priorities over the last 10 years? I mean, has this changed significantly in the wake of the European energy crisis?
In general, I would say it changes when circumstances change. So, for example, we had earlier stages of liberalization in the UK, in the Nordics in the past. And then there was a process and a gulf of liberalization quite some years ago. And then it was relatively calm on the legislative side of that. Changed mostly when the European climate law came into action, and when the packages like the EU Green Deal and Fit for 55 came into action. And since then, and definitely since COVID and the energy crisis, I would say the speed of legislative changes has definitely increased. We can clearly see that in the number of market messages that we're sending out towards our customers. It has increased multiple fold in the last 3 to 4 years. So we're definitely into a phase of energy market design adapting to the whole energy transition. I would even say that it's kind of catching up with the reality of what we have witnessed.
Okay, and just in terms of the personalities, not talking names, when when you're engaging in governmental relations with the EU around energy policy, market design, are the legislators, do they who's on sort of their side of the fence, if you'd like, in terms of expertise, or are these, is I mean, I'm sort of these are relatively complex subjects with huge ramifications. How, where does the expertise sit within the EU?
So on the side of the European Commission, we have, I would say, a few so-called DGs, Direct Generates, and those are quite strong and important. Like DG Energy is one that is important in all of this. DG Klima is another one that is important. On the side of the consumers, you have obviously sector organizations for aluminium, for steel sector, for plastic, for glass industry. So a few of those have really good knowledge on everything that is going on and are really involved in the daily basis. So for a lot of our industrial consumers, we always recommend them to have a strong contact with their sector organizations. And next to that, on the side of energy suppliers, we see that expertise and knowledge there is brought together via EFET, so the European Federation of Energy Traders, and there is really a good and strong knowledge and experience in energy markets as well. So they definitely play an important role every time a consultation is out.
Yeah, and we'll probably end up around sort of how strategies to understand and be involved in this process, the consultations, because these do have profound ramifications. Let's turn to that, because the first, I guess, item that's being discussed at the moment is electricity market, power market design. Before we talk about sort of what it is today and where it possibly is heading, why is this on the radar of the EU?
As everyone is aware, we're coming through a period of increased share of renewables, and that is something that is continuing and might even have to speed up to reach some of the 2030 and 2040 goals. And next to that, we had the energy crisis. And I would say the electricity market design review has been on the table for a very long time, but it's had this extra kick because of the increased speed of installation of renewables and the energy crisis that we went through. The idea of it is that we become less dependent on the price of fossil fuels, that there is more of a price stability and price predictability. And in order to do so, the Commission came with proposals for changing some regulation and directives, and eventually that's what got approved in May of this year, May 2024. And then directives are now being transposed into national legislation as we speak. So those are the main reasons of why this process now went a bit faster than anything that happened in the past.
So, sorry, and the legislation has been approved. It's now, how do you turn that into actually administering it? What does that actually mean from a regulatory standpoint, right?
Yeah. So when we look at regulation, there the impact for each of the member states is the same. It's published in the European Journal, and as of then, or 20 days later, it becomes active. For the directive, what each of the member states has to do, they have to transpose that into their national legislation. So they basically get certain guidelines and goals that they need to reach. The way they do it and the means that they use for that could be different among member states. So the way it's transposed into national legislation could be different between various countries.
Yeah, which causes a lot of complexity. Okay, so can you help us understand sort of what roughly speaking, how the power markets were designed, and then what this actually means in terms of these directives and the changes that could be enforced?
So when we look at it from a procurement, from a trading perspective, I would say two key concepts is, on one hand, the merit order, and on the other hand, the marginal cost principle. So the electricity price is set based on the merit order. Cheapest electricity comes in first, and then depending on marginal cost of each of that electricity that needs to be generated to complete the demand at any given moment in time, sets the price, and it's the last megawatt hour that you need. That's that marginal megawatt hour that you need that is eventually setting the price for all of the production. So it's not that each of the production assets has a different price. So they all clear at that same marginal cost price, the way that merit order is set. So that means when we look at such a merit order, we see that the share of cheap electricity that comes at least from a marginal perspective, and not necessarily from an investment perspective, but from a marginal perspective, a lot of renewables are coming into that equation and are pushing some of the more expensive marginal costs like coal and gas out of the equation. Still, as long as some gas-fired plants are into that merit order, they could be the ones that are determining the electricity price, and that's what we see.
Which is a good thing. So, and this is where sort of some of the geographical complexity, the different sort of generation mix comes into play with, say Spain with a lot of renewables and solar, and Scandinavia with a lot of hydro and so forth.
Exactly.
It's good for those renewables producers to benefit from the fact that the marginal pricing is delivered by gas, so everyone's getting a higher price for their electricity they produce, right? I mean, so it has that element, but it's also, this is a way, as far as I understand it, of course, this has worked in markets around the world because it incentivizes that last megawatt hour that's key to balancing the grid and avoiding brownouts and blackouts.
Yeah, indeed. So the underlying idea is that it makes sure that every megawatt hour that you need to keep the lights on, that it's paid in a decent and correct way. So for some countries like Spain, you can see, if you have a look at the number of hours where gas is still the marginal cost, that for most of the months that has dropped below 10%. So a lot of moments, renewables and hydro and nuclear are pushing gas and coal out of that equation, but still there are hours where it's in there. For other countries like the UK, like Italy, that number of hours where gas is setting the price is still much higher. So you still see that reflected in day-ahead markets, in forward markets. So it's giving its price difference between countries. On the other hand, some of the feedback of people is it's not going fast enough. We have been doing so much investments into all of the renewables. They produce electricity at zero marginal cost or very low marginal cost, and we don't see that fully reflected into our electricity price. So that's some of the criticism that we then hear on this merit order principle.
So essentially, the market, that's typically how many commodities work. It itself is successful in driving, making sure that the spice flows, so to speak. But there's this pushback, which is somewhat situational to Europe, but we can imagine going to other power markets as renewables create more and more of the mix. So, what is the alternative suggestion? And I guess I'm a little bit unclear at the moment. So, what exactly has been enacted?
So there is a bit of a debate on whether or not the merit order principle and the marginal cost, as we use it here, whether or not that's the best solution. For me, it's a theoretical debate on the fact that there is not much of a better alternative known yet to replace it. The direction they went into in this market design reform on an EU level is they used a few other principles that we know from increased renewables in the market. So they kind of want to integrate a few other principles next to the merit order. So at a certain moment, there were talks to abolish the idea of the merit order. They didn't go that far. They said we'll keep it, but next to it, we will introduce few other mechanisms. One of them is they want to make sure that capacity markets become more of a structural element into the electricity market rather than ad hoc. What we see across Europe is that capacity markets play their role in various member states, and they want to make that a bit more structural. So that means that you would not have an electricity only market. You would have kind of a traded market, and next to that, you would have capacity mechanisms. Next to that, the second step they took is they want, with the underlying idea of price predictability and stability, they want to push forward power purchase agreements, so PPAs. They want to give a role to member states to back PPAs for certain consumers, and they want to put them more central in the whole energy market, mostly in the whole electricity market. And lastly, what they want to push forward as well is the role of contract for differences, and more specifically, two-sided CFDs. So they want to work with a lower and upper boundary, and as long as markets are moving in, let's say, normal price territory, there is not much of an intervention. But if we would see prices dropping too much or spiking too much, then the contract for differences would come into play and would kind of protect either the consumer when prices are spiking or the producers when prices are falling too much. So that way they want to bring also a bit of long-term visibility and stability to investors and consumers that are off taking some of those renewable volumes.
Great for producers and the end users, and what does that mean for the trading market? Are you just introducing distortions that don't allow essentially for that efficient pricing and signals to the market about investment and indeed whether to switch back on a coal plant or whatever it might be?
Yeah, those components definitely will have their play. And you could argue, for example, on PPAs that those volumes are taken away from forward markets because they're bilateral deals between counterparties. Maybe later on nearby forward markets, they come back and play their role again in balancing and this kind of stuff. But on the longer forward markets, they take away maybe some liquidity. Similar for CFDs. Some of the volume there could be or having a different role than in forward markets or completely disappear from the forward market. So I think that's a valid point. It's a bit unclear at this moment in time, but the question is, all of those measures, what will they do with the liquidity of forward electricity markets as we know them at this moment in time?
Yeah, which could have a profound effect. When do these additional sort of legislation around or regulation around PPAs and contracts for difference, when does that actually start hitting the market?
It will take some time. So, as said, the regulation already was approved in May of this year. The directives are being transposed into national legislation. So, we expect to see most of the impact there starting next year.
Yeah. And then returning to this alternative to the merit and the marginal cost mechanism of pricing, the alternative, what is the alternative? Is that sort of that nodal and zonal pricing, and what does that then mean for markets? What's the potential concern there? And I'd like to also sort of lean back into this bit of an opportunity, that you've got these different goals within the member states.
I would say it's not anything on locational pricing or no. For me, it's not much of an alternative in the merit order because prices probably would be set still via the merit order principle. What we see, however, is that in some member states, like for example Germany, the discussion and the talk about locational pricing is definitely high on the agenda. And the reason for that is mostly because of constraints that we see or price differences that could occur between areas in a country. If we take Germany, there we see a lot of renewables being installed in the northern part with a lot of consumption in the southern part. The underlying idea is that a split in bidding zones would create more of a demand dynamic at the location where it's needed. Some other people say, well, just make sure that the grid infrastructure is there and then you don't need that split. Because again, there is the fear of liquidity that would disappear if you would start to split a market like Germany in multiple regions. Same fear happens in the UK, where talks are ongoing to do a split there. And in Italy, they're actually a step further already. And there we start to see some part of this being implemented. And there the question is, what will this mean for liquidity and for the functioning of the market? Will it put some restrictions on the functioning of the market? So for me, it's not really a replacement of the merit order, but it's a discussion that mostly runs next to it.
Okay, so it can't be a replacement. What is there any thoughts on alternatives out there that really move the needle away from marginal pricing?
The alternatives that we see is that some member states on themselves go a bit further than what is now implemented in this review. So, for example, Spain really pushed to decouple the pricing from electricity and gas to avoid price shocks on electricity when gas prices would move up. Also, Italy is now trying to make some of the low-cost electricity, renewable electricity available towards its energy-intense industry to make sure that they have access to this cheaper electricity, and that way they can protect their industry. So some member states go a bit further than what is now in the review.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. to help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities. HC Group launched ENCO Insights in 2023. ENCO has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. ENCO Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with ENCO's experts for anything from a 1-hour insights call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
It's this rise in protectionism and that pendulum swinging away from increasing liberalization and internationalization of energy markets that sort of Europe seems to be, ground zero for. We're going to circle back to that broader question of, and lots of people's fundamental strategies are based on the markets will stay the same and potentially further liberalize. And that might not be the case and raises questions about investments into trading platforms and so on. The second element to cover that's in front of the EU at the moment is gas market design. Can you tell us what's going on there and some sense of timelines?
So what we see in the gas market is that it was lagging behind a bit on electricity market. So electricity market design was already more adapted to the increased share of renewable electricity. That was not the case yet for gas markets. So what gas markets are doing now is they're kind of expanding into renewable gases. They're preparing for the new type of gases that would come online. So typically, well, we are all familiar with natural gas as a traded commodity. What we now see is more and more of a role for biomethane, or how they call them in Europe, RFNBO gases, so low carbon hydrogen, for example. So they kind of want to expand the framework and prepare for more of a renewable future in gas as well. They want to prepare for alternatives, let's say.
And I guess talking quantums here, what changes does that really bring to current gas market design?
It basically brings a new framework for those renewable gases. So before, everything was prepared only for natural gas. Since July 24, we have a regulation as part of this package, and you can hear it in the name as well. It's called the Hydrogen and Gas Decarbonization Package, so it clearly states what it is about. It now sets out a framework for those renewable gases as well, and it has the intention to install a sort of level playing field between natural gas and some of those renewable gases coming in. What will be interesting here to see is, will this lead to liquid markets for those renewable gases as well? Will we, in 4 or 5 years from now, say, well, we have a liquid biomethane gas that is functioning similar to what we used to know? Will we have a liquid gas for RFNBO gas? So that's kind of the direction that they want to head into.
Okay, so this is essentially, you can start allowing market pricing, hedging, all of those things that should hopefully accelerate those renewable gases in their various forms, provided, I guess, the baseline economics also work as well. Okay, so that's just to clarify that sort of, where does that sit in kind of that train as you described?
So the regulation was published in July of this year, so that is out there, and that was published into the EU journal, so that is active. On the directive, there they gave the member states a bit more time to transpose it into national legislation, and there the deadline to do so is mid of 2026. So there I expect a bit more time before we will really start to see the impact of all of this. For example, on low carbon hydrogen, we currently have a consultation that is still running and ongoing. So for the hydrogen market, one of the consultations is still ongoing. So where we set for electricity, more and more of an impact to be seen as of next year. I think for natural gas and other gases, we can say that it's probably more into 26 or maybe even 27.
Interesting. And I've got a question at the end about what this all means for the UK as well, right? There's sort of a dragon tag rights going on here. But the third big element is obviously CBAM and the carbon piece. We've discussed in and around CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, a fair bit. I guess the key bit for this discussion is that this translates essentially into an updated ETS scheme. Can you just help us understand what's going on there?
Yeah, we're in a bit of a pivotal phase when it comes to carbon pricing in Europe. So on one hand, we indeed have the transitional phase that we're in for CBAM. So we start to have the first sectors like hydrogen, like electricity, aluminium, where CBAM starts to or has the goal to bring a level playing field by implementing a carbon price on the outside borders of Europe. What we see is that then CBAM has a bit of an impact and an influence on EU ETS 1, because some of the industries that are now or will now fall under CBAM are still getting free allocation, and this free allocation will phase out. So by the phase in of CBAM, they will lose their free allocation under EU ETS 1. So those two are a bit linked to each other. And then thirdly, we see that there is the launch of the so-called EU ETS 2. So electricity already being covered under ETS 1 and going forward also under CBAM. That was less the case with anything that falls under heating and fuel oil. And that's the next step that the Commission wants to take, is to make sure that heating and fuel oil are also covered by a carbon price, and that will happen under ETS 2, that normally will take place as of 2027.
Right. Okay. And what does that mean for those markets? What's the timelines, but also is this creating uncertainty? What's going on in how do markets anticipate this?
When it comes to timeline, we see some first reporting obligations kicking in as of 2025. It will be fully operational as of 2027. The weak point is that we still see a lot of unclarity at this moment in time. There are a few things that we know already. We know that there will be no free allocation, so that is a big difference from EU ETS 1. We will know that the obligation will not lay on the side of the consumer, contrary to ETS 1, but it will be on the side of the importer or the energy supplier. What will be the same is that it basically means an extra traded commodity market in carbon pricing. So we will see a fully new carbon market appearing in Europe that will have its impact, this time not only on electricity producers and big industrial consumers, but also on smaller industrial consumers, on households, on people driving their car. So there will be much more of an impact on smaller consumers and on households.
Yeah, and presumably, therefore, the corollary being that a greater sort of markets opportunity for people trying to solve problems for those new suite of consumers, be they industrials or households.
Yeah, indeed. So if you have a look at the number of companies that will be impacted by ETS 2, that's still a very significant number of companies that will be out there. Main point will be, how will those energy suppliers pass through those costs towards those consumers? What will they do with households? Will they just pass through the energy cost of their own sourcing strategy for bigger industrial consumers that are too small for ETS 1, but still decent volume? Will they give direct access to the ETS 2 market to those industrial consumers so that they can implement their own risk management strategy on ETS 2, for example? That will be really a key factor to keep an eye on. Unfortunately, this market is not functioning yet, so we don't have a clear signal on pricing at this moment in state, since no futures are traded yet.
But still, organizations, companies need to be preparing for it, whether you're on the market side or you're, in the procurement world.
Yeah, I believe that to be an important one, because that's really a preparation that has to start with a lot of industrial consumers at this moment in time, also still with a lot of energy suppliers. So I think that will be really a key topic for Q4 24 and throughout 25, to make sure that your company is prepared for this.
And all the costs that are associated there, right?
Yes, indeed.
So just before we move on to how do you sort of get ahead of this, right? And how can organizations prepare for it? And the fact that we've got a changing landscape, just sort of the philosophy of this. Firstly, a lot of this has been set in motion in the wake of the energy crisis, but you could argue that the energy crisis was shorter and less significant than it could have been, precisely because things like the marginal cost model worked. In other words, the current setup works. Yes, of course, there's always disparities and challenges, but it seems to me that there's a bit of a danger here that you're reintroducing regulation, you're adding complexity, that complexity compounds, and it's also non-linear. And, if we were to rerun the energy crisis today, or in, let's say, a year's time, when a lot of the directives have actually been sort of implemented, things could be quite Is that an unfair statement? Sort of what's going on here?
No, I think starting with the idea whether if the question is, did marginal cost principle and the merit order, did it work during the energy crisis? Then I would say yes, it did what it had to do. In essence, it gave a price signal to make sure that either supply was increased or demand was reduced. So from that perspective, it worked perfectly. We went through an energy crisis. We had a lot of risk preparedness, and we had a lot of assessments whether or not there would be enough gas and enough electricity. But all in all, we went through it quite well from a security of supply perspective. The biggest, however, is at what cost? Bruegel, a Brussels-based think tank, they made some estimations there, and their estimation was that governments stepped in and supported households and industrial consumers for an amount of 657 billion euro since 2021. The crisis caused high prices. The model itself gave an incentive to lower demand and to increase supply where possible, but it came at a very high cost, and we still, until today, we still see that reflected, for example, in the industrial demand for natural gas in Europe. Some of the demand is gone. It's not there anymore, and that means that some of the industry might have been wiped out.
Out of interest, was the government intervention necessary, or was it anticipatory? Or if they hadn't have intervened as they did, because they ended up not needing to provide liquidity to some participants, but then there were others, the big German utilities, that really did need that intervention.
Indeed, I think we have a few categories where you could argue, in hindsight, it was necessary. For example, some of the big suppliers, if you think that they would have gone bankrupt during that energy crisis, the domino effect on other suppliers probably would have been big, and industrial consumers as well. So there, some of the intervention was necessary. On the other hand, we still see, until today, price restrictions in a country like Romania, where you could argue, is that still necessary? Is that still in line with the current situation in the market? There, I think some of the government measures that were taken were not necessary, and in hindsight were too much, or maybe even influencing the market in a wrong way.
Yeah, and there's also the argument that these events were so extreme, a major land war in Europe that essentially disconnected Europe's major source of natural gas, that no matter how you design a market, there are always these events that can overrun it, right? I mean, however, whatever changes are going on at the moment, or future reactions, they're still unlikely to stand up to those kind of events.
Yeah, it was indeed a huge stress test, and the question is, which model would have survived a stress test of this order? So until now, I haven't seen much of better proposals than anything that we have on the table at this moment.
Okay, then turning towards this trend of re-regulation in Europe, which after the US was really at the vanguard of liberalizing energy markets, in the late 90s. Can you just give us some sense, when you contrast it to the world, is this sort of the first region to start going back the other way? Because we still see deregulation going on. And, what can we learn from countries that have re-regulated? We're both thinking of the likes of Mexico.
At this moment in time, it doesn't seem like it's a full swing of the pendulum to the other side of the spectrum. I have to say, when I saw some of the earlier drafts of this, mainly the electricity market design reform, that you could see a stronger swing of the pendulum. So some people in the market have pushed back on this, and the outcome was a bit more balanced than some other ideas that were on the table previously. So, but definitely there is a bit of re-regulation going on, and the question is, will that lead to a better energy market, both for power and gas? I think the answer to that we can give in a few years from now. What we have seen in other countries, like what you give here as an example, Mexico, is they had a pendulum that had a swing left and right a few times. Mostly when government changed, they went from deregulation into regulation and deregulation again. So that brought a lot of uncertainty for industrial consumers there. And that was definitely not a good situation to be in, because some people took decisions based on the knowledge at that moment in time. And then a few months later, they completely changed direction again. So any changes that we need to do, whether or not it has to come with some re-regulation, I think has to go a bit more in the direction of an oil tanker changing course rather than changing it too swiftly. So we need to get a bit of visibility on what direction they want to head into. What they did in Europe now with the PPAs, with the contract for differences, with the capacity market, it gives us at least a bit of an idea of what direction they want to head into. And it brings a bit of flavor of re-regulation, yes, but not to the extent as what we saw, for example, in Mexico.
The key point is that uncertainty, right? Markets like certainty, the ability to invest. And as you say, Mexico's gone through a whole slew of, completely focused on liberalization. We should do an episode on Mexico. We were sort of there front and center in some of this in 2016, 2017, and now completely gone the other way. And, you can just see the likes of what's going on with Pemex as suffering the result. So the final bit, therefore, is I, run, an energy trading business in Europe, or I, on the board of a utility, or indeed a large industrial. How do I get ahead and involved in the conversation and participate in it to understand, to shape that policy as best as possible? Or the very least, if I don't have that scale and capacity to do that, understand it so that this isn't a surprise that shuts down my 5-year strategy I had just the day before.
Well, I would say the first one to start with is listening to this podcast. Obviously, that that helped because we try to give a bit of a summary here in a short period of time. Next to that, we made a reference to those consultations being out there. I believe it's overkill for everyone to participate in those consultations, but very often it's good to get a bit of a view on which kind of consultations are out there. And that's also one of the reasons that we developed these legislative trainings, just for people to make sure that those changes are on their radar. It's not necessary for everyone to go into every detail, but at least be aware of the highlights and a bit the direction that some of those things are heading. And next to that, I would say, if you don't go into the details and you don't do the lobbying yourself, then make sure that you at least have connections with sector organizations that are representing your interests, like the ones that I mentioned before, or that you work together with a consultant as us. That gives you a bit of an idea on what to expect going forward.
Yeah, you mentioned the European Federation of Energy Trading. That seems a key one. Participating in those sort of industry groups, so at least you're getting the digests and involved there. I mean, it just seems that you've got and again, this is all the backdrop of this is the energy transition, which has created already profound changes, as we've highlighted, in Europe's energy mix. You've got ongoing deglobalization, or at least sort of heightened policy volatility, and some of these discussions that are going on in the EU are member states that have different goals, setups, objectives, policies that are driving different decisions, right? Which in the end, it's very easy to go back in, and we've recently done an episode on protectionism to go there. And I guess all that I'm saying is the velocity of change, the impact of that change, is the significance of that change is coming faster and more furious, these last couple of years than they have been in the entire decade prior. And for organizations, especially small to medium-sized organizations, this is a real tax and challenge, because you just don't have the resources to be able to either participate, but certainly anticipate some of these changes.
Yeah, that's what we see in reality happening with some of those companies. Some of them are losing a bit track of the direction of the whole bunch of other companies and people. So they can't keep up necessarily with the speed of all the changes going on. And I think that's a dangerous situation to be in for some of those companies.
Yeah, and it creates that uncertainty that around investment and so forth that causes challenges. Well, Bart, it's been really interesting, and as you've already said, let's come back to this, in spring 2027. God willing, we're all around, and we can work through what actually has changed, and hopefully have some sense of what the impacts have been.
Yep, sounds like a good idea.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.